July 2026. The Eastern Pacific, 320 nautical miles southwest of Guatemala City. An unmanned surface vessel running autonomously at 6 knots. No crew, no lights, no radio chatter on open channels. A Saildrone Surveyor, 90 feet of sensor-packed hull, holds a patrol line that stretches 1,400 nautical miles from the Guatemalan coast to the northern boundary of the Galapagos Marine Reserve. It has been on station for 42 days. It will remain on station for 42 more. Every outlet that covered this reported the same story. A counter-narcotics patrol, the Navy and Saildrone expanding their partnership. Semi-submersibles and go-fast boats detected, interdicted, Coast Guard cutters queued in. A success story for unmanned maritime systems in the drug war. That story is true. It is also incomplete in exactly the ways that matter. Retention checkpoint. 000 hooks resolution T's. Right. They line. The Saildrone Surveyor ran from Guatemala to the Galapagos is not primarily a counter-narcotics line. It is a proof of concept for something the Navy has needed for a decade and could not build with hulled ships alone. It is a persistent, sensor-fused maritime domain awareness backbone across a 1,400-mile stretch of ocean that, not incidentally, receives more Chinese distant water fishing fleet traffic than any comparable zone in the Western Hemisphere. The narco mission is the operational cover. The strategic experiment is the architecture. And the architecture, once proven here, migrates directly to the Indo-Pacific. That is what this video decodes. The real audience for the Saildrones' 42-day Eastern Pacific line is not the Sinaloa cartel. It is the People's Liberation Army Navy. So the question the move plants is this: why does the United States need to prove a surveillance architecture against drug smugglers before it can deploy that architecture against a great power rival? And what does it mean that the proving ground is an ocean corridor connecting a Central American coast to an Ecuadorian marine sanctuary with one of the most contested exclusive economic zones on the planet? Those questions have a cold strategic answer. We will work through it methodically. If you want the strategy behind the headline instead of the headline, subscribe. This channel decodes the move, not the press release. Start with the ship count problem. It is the foundational constraint driving everything else. The United States Navy operates approximately 295 deployable battle force ships. The requirement to maintain presence across the Indo-Pacific, the Persian Gulf, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic approaches, the Arctic, and now the Eastern Pacific simultaneously has never been more demanding. The Chief of Naval Operations has stated publicly that the Navy needs somewhere between 355 and 500 ships to meet its strategic obligations. That gap is not closing, it is widening. The shipbuilding industrial base cannot produce hulls at the rate the strategy demands, and the cost per hull has increased at a rate that outpaces the defense budget's growth. This is not a funding problem that more money immediately solves. Shipyards require skilled workers, and skilled workers require years to train. A nuclear carrier takes approximately 7 years to build. An Arleigh Burke-class destroyer takes 3 to 4. The math does not favor the timeline. So the Navy has one legitimate path to increase presence without increasing hull count: unmanned systems that can hold patrol lines indefinitely at a fraction of the operating cost, with no crew risk. The Saildrone Surveyor is not a prototype in the experimental sense. It is an operational system. And the 42-day Eastern Pacific line is the Navy's demonstration that the operational concept works at scale. As retention checkpoint, for now clues, confluent, grip estimates take. The Saildrone Surveyor class vessel displaces approximately 14,000 pounds and carries a suite of sensors including electro-optical and infrared cameras, radar, acoustic detection equipment, and communications relay packages. It operates on wind and solar power, which gives it essentially unlimited range as long as weather conditions permit. Its operational ceiling is not fuel or provisions. It is the endurance of the sensors themselves and the bandwidth available to push data back to the queuing stations. On the Guatemala to Galapagos line, the Surveyor was linked to a network of assets. P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft operated out of Air Force Base Comalapa in El Salvador, roughly 50 miles southeast of San Salvador, provide the aerial layer. The P-8A carries a full suite of maritime surveillance sensors, can track both surface and subsurface contacts, and has a range of approximately 1,200 nautical miles without refueling. From Comalapa, P-8As can cover the full northern stretch of the Surveyor's patrol line. U.S. Coast Guard cutters, operating under joint command arrangements with 4th Fleet, provided the interdiction layer. When the Surveyor's sensors cued a contact of interest, whether a semi-submersible running low in the water or a go-fast boat running at night, the cutter could be vectored in. The Surveyor provides the persistent watch, the cutter provides the enforcement action. The P-8A provides the overhead picture. 3 platforms, 3 roles, 1 architecture. The number that matters. The Surveyor's operating cost per day is a fraction of a Coast Guard cutter's. The cutter burns fuel continuously. The Surveyor harvests wind. Over a 42-day patrol, that asymmetry in operating cost means you can maintain the Surveyor on station for the entire period, while the cutter operates only when cued, conserving its own endurance for the moment it is needed. One detail from reviewing the Saildrone technical documentation that stayed with me. The Surveyor's passive acoustic sensors can detect semi-submersible propulsion signatures at distances that would be impossible for a surface ship's own sensors.
The semi-sub is designed to evade radar by riding low in the water. It cannot ride low enough to evade passive acoustic detection from a platform with no propulsion noise of its own. That is an asymmetry the cartels have not solved, and it is the same asymmetry the Navy is banking on in a different context entirely.
Now the geography. Because the geography is the point. The Galapagos Exclusive Economic Zone extends 200 nautical miles from the Galapagos Islands, placing its outer boundary roughly 750 nautical miles west of the Ecuadorian mainland. Ecuador claimed the archipelago and its EEZ under standard UN close provisions. The marine reserve inside the EEZ is protected under Ecuadorian law and international agreements. Fishing within the marine reserve by non-licensed vessels is prohibited. Since 2020, the Chinese distant water fishing fleet has operated in significant numbers just outside the Galapagos EEZ boundary. In 2020, a fleet of more than 340 Chinese vessels was tracked by multiple maritime monitoring organizations operating in the area. The numbers in subsequent years have varied, but the pattern has been consistent. Large concentrations of Chinese vessels, including motherships that function as logistics and processing hubs for smaller fishing boats, operating at the edge of or just inside the boundary of the Galapagos EEZ. The Ecuadorian Coast Guard has limited capacity to monitor this activity across a 200-mile zone with the resources it possesses. The Marine Reserve has documented significant pressure on its fish stocks during periods of high fleet activity. And the Chinese distant water fishing fleet is not simply a commercial enterprise. Retention checkpoint, 50% mid-roll hook Kailis. This is the layer most outlets covering the Saildrone counter-narcotics story did not touch. The Chinese distant water fishing fleet includes vessels that have been documented, in other theaters, operating in ways consistent with the role of maritime militia. In the South China Sea, Chinese fishing vessels have been observed relaying position data on other nations' naval movements, anchoring in disputed zones to establish physical presence, and interfering with other vessels' operations in ways that blur the line between civilian fishing and paramilitary action. The Galapagos fleet is not confirmed to be performing these functions in this theater. What is confirmed is that the same fleet architecture, the same vessel types, the same operational patterns, appear in both locations, and the Galapagos is inside the U.S.-designated Western Hemisphere Security Zone, approximately 900 miles from the Ecuadorian coast, and within easy range of transit corridors that run north toward U.S. approaches. The strategic question is not whether Chinese fishing vessels near the Galapagos are currently gathering intelligence on U.S. military movements. The strategic question is whether the United States has persistent domain awareness across that corridor to know what is happening there. Before the Saildrones' 42-day line, the honest answer was not consistently. After it, the answer is different. What's most surprising about this operation isn't the counter-narcotics take. It is that the U.S. Navy found a way to build persistent maritime domain awareness across a 1,400-mile corridor at operating costs that a normal patrol ship schedule cannot match, using the one threat the public instinctively understands and supports, which is drug interdiction, as the framing for what is functionally a strategic surveillance architecture. The cartels are real. The drug interception is real. The Surveyor cued Coast Guard cutters to real drug seizures during this patrol. None of that is theater. But the architecture that enables those interdictions is simultaneously enabling something else, and the Navy understands this, because the Navy designed it that way. Here is the take that will probably generate some disagreement. The Pentagon has been using the counter-narcotics mission as a development laboratory for unmanned maritime systems for years, and this represents a significant shift in how those systems' capabilities should be understood, not because the drug mission is illegitimate, but because treating these vessels only as counter-narcotics tools systematically undersells what they represent strategically. The Saildrone Surveyor is not a Coast Guard tool that happens to be useful to the Navy. It is a Navy strategic asset that happens to serve Coast Guard purposes extremely well, and not a doctrinal move. Because the doctrine is the architecture, and the architecture is the template, the Navy's concept for unmanned surface vessels has evolved considerably since 2020. The initial emphasis was on mine countermeasures and specific tactical functions. What emerged from operational experience, including earlier Saildrone deployments in the Persian Gulf alongside 5th Fleet, is a broader concept. The unmanned vessel as a persistent sensor node, integrated into a fleet architecture rather than operating as a standalone platform. In the Persian Gulf, Saildrone explorers and surveyors operated alongside the Task Force 59 Unmanned Systems program, which explicitly linked unmanned surface vessels, unmanned underwater vehicles, and unmanned aerial systems into a joint sensor network. Task Force 59 demonstrated that these platforms, networked together, could maintain maritime domain awareness across the Gulf's choke points with a fraction of the crewed ship presence previously required. The Eastern Pacific operation is the Western Hemisphere version of that experiment, and the geometry is instructive. The Saildrones patrol line ran from approximately 14 degrees north latitude near the Guatemalan Pacific coast to approximately 1 degree north near the northern boundary of the Galapagos EEZ. That corridor brackets the Pacific approaches to the Panama Canal. Everything that moves between South America and North America by sea, whether commercial shipping, go-fast boats, semi-submersibles, or vessels of interest to naval intelligence, transits somewhere within or adjacent to this corridor. Persistent sensor coverage of that corridor is strategically significant independent of the counternarcotics mission. A contact database built over months of continuous observation creates a baseline of what is normal in those waters. When something abnormal appears, whether a vessel with no AIS transponder, an unusual fleet concentration, or a contact pattern inconsistent with commercial shipping routes, the system detects the deviation because it knows the baseline. A microfinal arc transition. In and of itself, the cartel semi-submersible and the Chinese maritime militia mothership are detected by the same logic. The former rides low to evade radar. The latter often runs with falsified or disabled AIS transponders to obscure its position. Both are anomalies against a baseline. The Saildrones' 42-day patrol built that baseline for a 1,400-mile corridor. That baseline does not disappear when the Saildrone rotates off station. The data persists. The contact database persists. The pattern of life analysis persists. The architecture learns. Now the Indo-Pacific pivot, because this is where the strategic argument closes. The Navy's problem in the Indo-Pacific is the same problem at larger scale. The distances are greater. The choke points are more numerous, the adversary is more capable, and the ship count gap is more acute, because the Indo-Pacific consumes more of the fleet's available presence than any other theater. The first island chain, running from Japan through the Ryukyu Islands, Taiwan, the Philippines, and down to Borneo, represents the primary strategic boundary in the Pacific competition with China. Inside the chain, China operates from interior lines with shorter supply and communication distances. Outside the chain, the United States operates from exterior lines requiring longer reach and more platforms to maintain presence across the relevant sectors. The choke points in the first island chain. The Taiwan Strait at approximately 110 miles wide. The Luzon Strait between Taiwan and the Philippines at approximately 250 miles wide. And the various passages through the Philippine archipelago represent the critical transit corridors. The volume of shipping through these passages, and the military significance of controlling or monitoring them, makes persistent maritime domain awareness across the chain a foundational requirement. The Navy currently maintains that awareness through a combination of crewed ships, P-8A patrols, submarine operations, and satellite coverage. Each of those methods has gaps. Crewed ships must rotate on and off station, creating predictable gaps in coverage. P-8As fly point-in-time passes, not continuous coverage. Submarines provide exceptional intelligence on subsurface contacts but limited surface surveillance. Satellite coverage is persistent but dependent on orbit schedules and subject to countermeasures. An unmanned surface vessel network operating across the passages of the first island chain would fill those gaps. A Surveyor-class USV can hold a patrol line for months. It does not need to rotate. It does not create predictable gaps. It operates at a cost per patrol day that allows more coverage with the same budget. The problem has been proving the operational concept at scale, proving that the queuing architecture works, proving that a surveyor can maintain station through weather, through equipment challenges, through extended autonomous operation, and provide actionable intelligence to crewed platforms that can then take enforcement or defensive action. We dug through the 4th Fleet operational reporting and Saildrone press material, and one figure kept appearing in multiple contexts: the 42-day continuous operation. Prior Saildrone missions in the Gulf had reached 30 days as a sustained operational benchmark. The Eastern Pacific mission extended that by 12 days. That extension is not incidental. The Navy was testing endurance, not just capability. A Saildrone network across the Luzon Strait, the passages between the Philippine Islands, and the approaches to Taiwan, operating at the same endurance standard demonstrated in the Eastern Pacific, would provide continuous surface surveillance of every vessel transiting those corridors, every PA and surface vessel, every Chinese Coast Guard ship, every maritime militia fishing fleet concentration, on a permanent basis, at operating costs that the fleet budget can sustain. That is not a concept. That is a capability the Eastern Pacific operation just proved is achievable. What do you think? Is this the right trade-off, spending defense resources to maintain surveillance of civilian fishing vessels that may or may not have military roles? Drop your view in the comments. Now, the rival's problem. Because a strategic move only matters if it creates a dilemma the rival cannot resolve cheaply. China's maritime militia model depends on ambiguity. The fishing vessels that probe contested EEZ boundaries, that anchor in disputed zones, that relay information on opposing naval movements, operate in the gray zone between civilian and military activity precisely because that ambiguity creates friction for the opposing force. Engaging a fishing vessel carries political costs. Ignoring it creates operational risks. The ambiguity is the tool. Persistent domain awareness degrades that ambiguity. When you have a continuous contact database on every vessel operating in a defined corridor, the pattern of life analysis distinguishes normal fishing behavior from behavior consistent with intelligence gathering or positional gaming. A fishing vessel that fishes the same zone for 30 days looks different in a contact database than a fishing vessel that transits a corridor at a consistent speed, maintains position near known submarine patrol routes, and operates its communications equipment in patterns inconsistent with commercial fishing. The Saildrone does not resolve that contact as a threat. It flags it as anomalous. The flagging is what creates options. Options the opposing force cannot easily suppress. China has counter-unmanned system capabilities, electronic warfare systems, laser systems designed to degrade electro-optical sensors, vessels that have been documented in the South China Sea engaging in unsafe approaches to survey vessels. Degrading or interfering with a Saildrone Surveyor is technically possible, but interfering with a Saildrone operating in international waters, on a counternarcotics mission sanctioned by bilateral agreements with regional partners, creates a diplomatic problem that is far more costly than the surveillance the interference was intended to prevent. That political constraint is part of the architecture's design. The Eastern Pacific operation was conducted with the knowledge and support of Ecuador, Colombia, and Guatemala. Regional partners provided basing, logistics, and cooperative legal frameworks. The Fourth Fleet footprint in the region includes formal counter-narcotics cooperation agreements with most Pacific Coast states in Central and South America. The Saildrone operated within that framework, which means any interference with it is interference with a cooperatively sanctioned law enforcement operation. Move that architecture to the Indo-Pacific, within the framework of existing alliances with Japan, the Philippines, and Australia, and the same political constraint applies. A planned vessel that interferes with a Saildrone operating under U.S.-Philippine counter-narcotics or maritime safety agreements is not just harassing an unmanned system. It is confronting a multilateral framework, which carries costs China consistently seeks to avoid. This is the geometry that makes the Eastern Pacific operation strategically significant. It is not just a technology demonstration. It is an operational template that includes the diplomatic and legal architecture needed to make the technology politically sustainable. Looking back, the real question about this operation is not whether the Saildrone can detect semi-submersibles. It can. The question is whether the United States has found an operational model that allows it to maintain persistent surveillance in contested waters without the political friction that crude naval presence creates. And the 42-day Eastern Pacific line suggests the answer is yes, under the right cooperative framework. The second-order consequences. What the rival must now calculate. If the Navy deploys Saildrone networks across the approaches to the first island chain under the framework of existing alliance agreements, the plan faces a persistent surface surveillance problem it does not have a clean answer to. Jamming the Saildrones would require electronic warfare coverage across patrol lines that extend hundreds of miles, drawing on assets that China needs in other contexts. Physical interference would require PAN or Coast Guard vessels to maintain continuous presence alongside the Saildrone network, an expensive and operationally demanding commitment. Attempting to operate maritime militia vessels under persistent Saildrone coverage degrades the ambiguity on which that operational model depends. None of these responses is free. Each creates a dilemma the rival must resource. Meanwhile, the cost of maintaining the Saildrone network is a fraction of the cost of maintaining the crewed ship presence it augments. The asymmetry in operating cost is the strategic leverage. For every dollar the Navy spends maintaining a Saildrone patrol line, China must spend multiples of that dollar attempting to counter or neutralize it. That asymmetry compounds over time. The counter-unmanned system development that China would need to field against a distributed Saildrone network is itself expensive to develop, test, and deploy. And deploying it against Saildrones operating under alliance frameworks creates the political friction described above. The rivals' calculus is unfavorable, not impossible, not terminal, but unfavorable, in ways that accumulate. Microfinal, approaching close aggregate. There is one variable the Eastern Pacific operation has not yet resolved. The Saildrone network works when it operates within a cooperative legal and diplomatic framework. Ecuador, Colombia, Guatemala cooperated.
The Philippines, Japan, and Australia have deep alliance frameworks with the United States that would support a similar cooperative structure.
But the most contested waters in the Indo-Pacific, the areas most critical to the strategic competition with China, are also the areas where the diplomatic framework is most complex. The South China Sea, where China claims virtually all maritime territory, where multiple ASEAN states have overlapping and contested claims, is not a clean cooperative space. Operating Saildrones in the South China Sea under a counternarcotics or maritime safety framework requires willing partners who are themselves willing to accept the political costs of Chinese displeasure. Some partners can absorb that cost, some cannot, and the calculus shifts depending on the specific waters and the specific bilateral relationships involved. That unresolved variable is real. The architecture proven in the Eastern Pacific works within existing frameworks. The question of whether those frameworks extend cleanly to the most contested waters remains open. Engage on that in the comments. Will you see yes to Saildrone expansion into the South China Sea under the Philippines alliance framework, or is the diplomatic complexity too high? The answer shapes the whole next chapter of this strategy. The cold strategic close. The United States Navy has a ship count problem it cannot solve by building ships fast enough. It has a presence requirement across multiple simultaneous theaters that exceeds what its current hull inventory can sustain, and it faces a rival whose gray zone maritime operations exploit every gap in persistent maritime domain awareness. The 42-day Eastern Pacific Line addressed all three of those problems in a single operational template. It demonstrated sustained unmanned surface vessel endurance beyond previous operational benchmarks. It proved the queuing architecture linking unmanned sensors to crewed enforcement platforms. It built a contact database across a 1,400-mile corridor that serves both counternarcotics and strategic surveillance purposes. And it did so within a cooperative legal framework that provides political protection for the operation and creates diplomatic costs for any interference. The move was framed as a drug war operation. It was executed as a drug war operation. And it was also a proof of concept for the Navy's answer to the ship count problem in the Indo-Pacific. The Saildrone ran 1,400 miles on wind and solar power. It did not need a crew. It did not need a port visit. It did not need a relief rotation. It held station for 42 days and transmitted continuous contact data to assets that used that data to interdict drug shipments and not incidentally map every anomalous maritime contact in a strategic corridor adjacent to the Panama Canal's Pacific approach. If the architecture scales as the Eastern Pacific operation suggests it can, the Navy's presence in the first island chain is not limited by hull count. It is limited by the number of Saildrones it can deploy and maintain, which is a manufacturing and logistics problem that is orders of magnitude more tractable than the shipbuilding problem. The board favors this approach today. The counter-unmanned system competition is accelerating. China is developing its own unmanned maritime systems. The technology gap is not permanent. The window to establish the operational template, the alliance frameworks, and the contact database baselines closes over time. What the 42-day Eastern Pacific Line demonstrates is that the window is open now. The Navy moved to use it. The Surveyor came off station after 42 days. The contact database stayed. The patrol line will be re-established. The architecture does not care about the crew rotation schedule because there is no crew to rotate. It is persistent by design. That is the answer to the ship count problem, not more ships. A different kind of presence. One thing that does not sit right, even now. The broader public conversation about naval unmanned systems still treats them primarily as supplements to crewed platforms, useful for dangerous or dull missions that you would rather not risk a crew on. That framing misses the structural point. The Saildrone Surveyor is not a supplement. It is an alternative model of presence, one that does not degrade over deployment length, does not require port visits, and does not broadcast crew morale and fatigue as operational constraints the adversary can exploit. The Eastern Pacific operation proved that model works at operational scale. The question now is the pace and geography of its expansion. For the next move on this board, subscribe. The Pacific competition is moving faster than the news cycle tracks, and the moves that matter are rarely the ones that lead the coverage. The Saildrone held station for 42 days. No crew, no port, no gap. That is not a counter-narcotics story. That is a strategic architecture, and it only reads one way.